The checkpoint on Farm to Market 1431 was manned on a Wednesday and gone by Friday. I know this because I drove past it both days. Wednesday, there were 3 Humvees, a portable barrier system, 2 privates checking IDs with a laminated reference sheet, and a staff sergeant on a radio who wouldn't look at anyone directly. Friday, there was a strip of orange tape across the road, already half torn by wind, and a single MRE wrapper pinned under a sandbag that hadn't been collected. I need to say this clearly because I've told it 3 times now to 3 different people, and none of them have written anything down. I am not speculating. I'm telling you what I saw, what I did, and what happened to the people who were with me. If you want speculation, you can talk to anyone. Everyone has a theory. Theories are free. What I have is a sequence of days. My name is Andrea Garza. I'm 34. I taught 7th grade life science at Leander Middle School, which is northwest of Austin, Texas, in a suburb that didn't exist 20 years ago. Tract homes, roundabouts, a Costco, 2 HEBs, more dentists per capita than anywhere needs. That's where I live with my husband, Marco. And that's where we were when the infrastructure started behaving strangely in early March. I say strangely because that's what it was before it was anything else. Strangely. The automated trash pickup skipped our street twice. The school district sent 3 emails in one afternoon about revised attendance protocols without specifying what had been revised. Cedar Park Regional had a parking lot full of ambulances that weren't moving. You notice these things or you don't. I noticed because I drive the same route every day, and I count things without meaning to. It's not a disorder, it's a teacher's habit. You count heads. Marco noticed different things. He noticed the gas station on Whitestone was limiting purchases to $20. He noticed the neighbors on both sides had stopped putting their cans out. He noticed that the Nextdoor app had gone silent. Not panicked, not active, just silent, which, if you've ever lived in a Texas suburb, you know is the abnormal state. Someone is always complaining about a dog or a package or a left turn. Neither of us said anything to the other for almost 4 days. I don't know why. I think we were both waiting for the thing to name itself, and until it did, acknowledging it felt premature, like calling in sick before you have a fever. You wait for the fever. The fever is permission to act. The fever came on a Tuesday, not a metaphor. Alejandra Munoz, who sits 2nd row, 3rd seat in my 4th period class, put her head down at 11:40, and when I touched her shoulder to wake her, her skin was so hot, I pulled my hand back like I'd touched a stove eye. The nurse came. Then the nurse came back 20 minutes later for another one. By 5th period, the principal was on the intercom saying, "Early release. All students effective immediately. Parents notified." The intercom clicked off and came back on and said staff should remain until 3:15 for a briefing. The briefing never happened. At 2:50, the vice principal walked through the halls telling us to go home. She was carrying her purse and her car keys and a framed photo from her desk. And she did not stop walking while she said it. I called Marco from the parking lot. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was already holding his phone. He said his office had sent everyone home at noon. He said the Mopac was empty in both directions, which was wrong for 3 p.m. on a weekday, in a way that felt like the city had been evacuated without telling us. I said I was coming home. He said he was already there. He said the water pressure was low. That night, we sat at the kitchen table and finally said the things we'd both been not saying. The silence between us broke, and it wasn't dramatic. It was more like when a pipe fitting fails, a slow, wet release of pressure. We said, something is happening. We said, we don't know what. We said, do we leave or do we stay? We said, let's wait one more day. We said, let's wait one more day. Then we waited another one. This is how it works. You wait because waiting is easier than deciding. And every day you wait, the decision gets harder because you've accumulated another day's worth of reasons to believe that staying was correct. Your cough-blabber here, your food is here, your walls are here. You know where the flashlights are. Thursday, the power went out for 6 hours and came back at reduced voltage. Everything dim. The refrigerator laboring. The internet was gone entirely by then. Cell service was intermittent, in a pattern I eventually realized was geographic. I could get a signal in the backyard near the fence, but not inside the house. And by Saturday, I couldn't get one anywhere. Marco's truck radio still pulled FM. There was one station broadcasting, a loop, a male voice reading what sounded like prepared text. Avoid public gatherings, shelter in place. Do not approach individuals exhibiting disorientation, aggression, or apparent injury inconsistent with visible cause. Report suspected cases too, and then a phone number that, when I tried it on the landline we still had, rang 40 times without answer. The word they used on the radio was affected, not infected, not dead, not undead. Affected. Individuals who are affected may present with a range of behavioral changes. I'm a science teacher. I know what it means when official language goes vague. It means they either don't understand the mechanism or they've decided the public can't handle the mechanism. Either way, the vagueness is the message. Friday morning, I opened the front door to check the street, and there was a woman on the sidewalk I didn't recognize. She wasn't from the neighborhood. She was wearing scrubs, green, clinical, and one shoe. She was standing still in a way that was wrong, not frozen still. The way a deer is still before it decides. I watched her for probably 90 seconds. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anything. Her head was tilted about 15 degrees off vertical, and her mouth was open slightly, and I could not tell if she was breathing. Then she walked. Not toward me, not away, perpendicular to my sight line, across the Hendersons' lawn, between two houses, gone. The walk was fluid, normal, the kind of walk you do in a hallway. But she'd been standing there for God knows how long before I opened the door. And she'd be standing somewhere else now, and the stillness was the thing. The stillness was the tell. I closed the door and locked it, and told Marco, and he said he'd seen one too yesterday from the upstairs window. A man near the retention pond at the end of the street, standing in the water up to his shins, facing the tree line, just standing. For an hour. Then walking away normally. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, I didn't know it was a thing yet. I thought he was just a person. I said, he was a person. Marco looked at me, and I looked at him, and I understood that we were now in a conversation about what person meant, and neither of us wanted to have it yet, so we didn't. Saturday, we saw the checkpoint for the first time. Marco drove us. I don't remember why we were driving. Maybe water, maybe gas, and it was just there at the 1431 intersection, a few hundred yards past the roundabout. Soldiers, barriers, a line of cars being processed one at a time. We waited 40 minutes. When we reached the front, a private who looked 19 took Marco's license, looked at a sheet of paper, looked at Marco's face, looked at my face, handed the license back and said, "Go ahead." Didn't explain what he was checking. Didn't explain what would happen if the check failed. We drove through and got water from a distribution point at the HEB parking lot. Pallets of cases, a National Guard kid handing them out, a handwritten sign that said, "Limit 2 per vehicle." We took our 2 cases and drove home. Monday, I went past the checkpoint again. Same soldiers, or similar ones, same procedure. This time the line was longer. I counted 38 vehicles. I was alone. Marco was home reinforcing the back fence because he'd heard something against it the night before. Not a knock, but a lean, he said. A sustained pressure, and when I reached the private, he did the same thing. License, sheet, face, go ahead. But this time, I asked, I said, "What are you checking for?" He looked at me for a moment that stretched, and I saw something in his face I recognized from my classroom. A student who doesn't know the answer, but has been told to perform as if he does. "Ma'am, we're ensuring safe passage through this corridor." That's what he said, that ensuring safe passage. A sentence from a briefing he'd memorized. I said, "Safe from what?" He said, "Ma'am, please proceed." I said, "Are we in danger here?" He leaned closer and his voice dropped and he said, "Drive home and stay there. If someone comes to your door who doesn't look right, don't open it. If someone in your house starts behaving differently, call the number on the broadcast." He paused. "If the number doesn't work, just don't be in the same room with them." Then he straightened and waved the car behind me forward, and I was dismissed. I drove home. I told Marco. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Differently how?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Like the woman in the scrubs?" I said, "I don't know, maybe." He said, "Or like different from who they were." I didn't answer because I understood what he was asking. He was asking whether the change would be visible, like the stillness, like the one shoe, like the standing in water, or whether it would be internal. Whether someone could be affected and still look like themselves. Whether you'd know. Whether I'd know looking at him. Whether he'd know looking at me. This was Monday. Wednesday, 2 days later, I drove past the checkpoint, and it was gone, not reduced, not relocated. Gone, the barriers were still there, but pushed to the road's edge. The sandbags were in a pile that looked dropped rather than stacked. There were tire tracks in the mud where the Humvees had been, deep tracks, fast tracks, the kind that mean urgency. No soldiers, no laminated sheets, no orange tape across the road yet. That came Friday. On Wednesday, it was just absence. as if someone had told them to go and they'd gone immediately and without protocol. I sat in my car at the checkpoint location for 10 minutes. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe I was waiting for them to come back. Maybe I was waiting for the explanation that never came. The broadcast, the notification, the automated call. Attention, residents. Military presence in your area has been reassigned to a higher priorities zone something. Anything. Language that would tell me whether I was being abandoned or whether the danger had passed or whether... And this was the thought I couldn't hold for more than a second. Whether whatever they were checking for had gotten inside the perimeter and there was no longer a purpose to a perimeter. I drove home. I told Marco. He was quiet, and then he said the thing that changed the shape of the next 2 weeks. He said, "We should get other people." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We should find out who's still here, and we should be together. We can't do this with 2. He was right. I knew he was right, because I'd been counting, and the count was wrong. Our street had 22 houses. I could account for occupancy in maybe 6 of them. The rest had dark windows, still driveways, no movement. Some people had left early. The Okafor family went to Houston the first week. I saw them loading the van. Others, I couldn't say. I didn't know if they'd left, or if they were inside, or if they were standing in some retention pond somewhere tilting their heads. Marco went door to door that afternoon. I watched from the porch because I couldn't make myself go with him. And I've thought about why, and I think it's because knocking on doors felt like a test I might fail. Every door that opened would be a person I had to evaluate. Every face would be a question. Are you still you? I didn't want to be the one asking. He came back with a list. Karen Lundquist, 4 houses down, alone. Her husband was in Dallas on business when the phone stopped, and she hadn't heard from him since. Jim and Delia Pratt, end of the street, both retired, both armed in a way that Marco said felt more scared than aggressive. The Reeves kid, Caleb, 19, who was house-sitting for his parents who were in Florida, and who had a generator and half a garage full of camping supplies. Family, and the Johannes Favnen, and their 2 kids, 8 and 11, who Marco said were the calmest of anyone, who had already organized their house into zones and schedules, and who asked Marco to come back at 7 p.m. with anyone who wanted to coordinate. So at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday in March, the same day the checkpoint vanished, there were 9 adults and 2 children in Solomon and Feven's living room, and we were making a plan. Not a survival plan in the way you see in movies. No one was talking about weapons or fortification or escape routes. We were making a plan for daily life. Water collection, since the tap was now intermittent. Food inventory. Who had what, how long it would last combined, how to distribute. Watch rotation, not for defense, but for information. Someone awake at all times to see what was happening on the street. Communication protocol. If you saw something, you walked to the next house and said it. No shouting. No running unless running was the only option. Solomon had a whiteboard. He wrote things down. I remember being grateful for the whiteboard in a way that made my throat tight. Someone was writing things down. Someone was making it organized. I hadn't realized how much of my fear was structural. Not fear of what was outside, but fear that inside had no structure at all. That first meeting lasted until almost 11. The Pratt house had a hand-crank radio, and Jim reported what he'd heard. Same loop, same language, but now with a new addition. A recorded female voice that said, between repetitions of the shelter-in-place message, military and emergency assets are being prioritized for critical infrastructure zones. Areas outside designated critical zones should maintain shelter protocols until further notice. Jim said it had been playing since that morning. Karen asked, "Are we in a critical zone?" No one answered because we all knew. We were a subdivision off a farm road. We were a neighborhood. We were not critical. The hospitals were critical. The water treatment plants were critical. The interstates were critical. We were houses where people lived, and people who lived in houses were being told to wait. Caleb, the kid, 19, buzz cut, nervous energy, said, "Wait for what, though?" They pulled the checkpoint. "What's the plan for us?" Marco said, "There is no plan for us." I remember the silence after that. The kids were asleep in the next room. The adults sat with it. There was no plan for us. We were the space between critical zones. We were the area that the radio addressed with passive verbs. Protocols should be maintained. By whom? By us. With what? With whatever we already had. For how long until further notice? And if notice never came, then we were on our own, which we already were. The next morning, I was on watch. We'd set it up quickly, 2-hour shifts. The back patio of the Johannes house, which had the best sight line, and I saw my second affected person up close. Closer than the woman in scrubs. He came from the direction of the green belt, behind the houses, walking through the gap where the Mueller's fence had a broken panel. He was white, maybe 50, heavyset, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt, the uniform of every dad in the neighborhood, every weekend trip to Lowe's. He walked into the Mueller's backyard and stopped. He stood in the center of their lawn, facing their back door. I was maybe 60 feet away. I could see his face clearly in the morning light, and his face was, this is hard to describe without sounding like I'm being dramatic. His face was correct. Everything was in the right place. His eyes were open, his mouth was closed. But there was an absence of microexpression that made him look rendered. Like a photograph of a face rather than a face. No muscle movement around the eyes. No shifting of weight. No blinking that I could see, though at 60 feet I might have missed blinks. He stood there for 12 minutes. I timed it because timing things was my job on watch. 12 minutes facing the Mueller's back door. Then he raised his right hand and placed it flat against the glass of the sliding door. Not a knock, a placement. Palm flat, fingers spread. He held it there for another 2 minutes. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. Through the fence gap, into the green belt. Gone. I wrote it in the log we'd started keeping. Time, description, behavior, direction of travel, duration. Solomon had suggested the log. He said, "We don't know what matters yet. Write everything. Later we'll know what mattered." He was an engineer. He thought in systems. I was grateful for him in a way I can't fully articulate. not just for his competence, but for his refusal to be abstract about it. He didn't want to talk about what the affected people were, or what was causing it, or what it meant. He wanted to talk about water purification and perimeter awareness and caloric ratios. He wanted to solve the problem we could solve, which was, how do 9 adults and 2 children stay alive and organized and sane? But the question Caleb had asked, wait for what, didn't go away. It lived in the house with us. Every day we maintained protocol, we were also waiting. And every day nothing came, we were also being told, in the negative space where rescue should have been, that nothing was coming. 4 days after the checkpoint disappeared, Marco and I had a fight. Not a real fight. We don't do those. We do cold silences and logistical disagreements that stand in for the emotional thing we can't say. The logistical disagreement was about whether to drive south toward Austin proper to see what was there. I wanted to. He didn't. I said, we need information. We have no information. We're making decisions in the dark, he said. The last information we had was the checkpoint, and the checkpoint is gone. The roads might not be safe, I said. We don't know that, he said. We don't know anything. That's the point. We don't drive into what we don't know. I said, and I'm including this because it's the kind of thing you say that you think about later, for a long time. I said, we're already inside what we don't know. We've been inside it for 2 weeks. The only difference between here and 10 miles south is that here, we've decided to call it safe because we sleep here. He looked at me, and I watched his jaw work, and he said, then I'll go. You stay, I said. No, he said, one of us goes, one stays. That way if, I said. No, we don't split. We already agreed. He said, you want to go together? I said, yes. He said, and if we don't come back, Karen and Jim and Solomon and Phelan and Caleb and the kids lose 2 people and a truck, and they don't even know what happened to us. I didn't have an answer. He was right. Leaving together was selfish. Leaving solo was dangerous. Not leaving was ignorance. Every option had a cost, and none of them were payable. In the end, we didn't go. Not that day. The decision unmade itself the way decisions do when you can't afford any of the options. It just receded. We went back to watches and water and the log and the daily rhythm that Solomon had built, which held us the way a lesson plan holds a class. Not perfectly, not without disruption, but well enough that the hours passed in recognizable shapes. 6 days after the checkpoint, Delia Pratt didn't come to the morning coordination meeting. Jim came alone. He sat in his usual chair in Solomon's living room, and he said Delia was feeling off. He said she'd been tired. He said she'd slept 14 hours the night before and woken up disoriented. He said she'd asked him what day it was 3 times in an hour. The room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone thinks the same thing, and no one wants to be the one who says it. Solomon said, how is she now? Jim said, sleeping again. Karen said, is she warm? Jim said, what do you mean? Karen said, does she have a fever? Jim said, I didn't check. She's just tired. She's 73. She gets tired. Nobody spoke. Jim looked around the room at all of us, and I watched his face go from confused to offended to scared in about 4 seconds. He said, It's not. She's just tired. People get tired, Marco said gently. Of course. We just want to make sure. Can someone come check on her later? Andrea was a science teacher. She's not a doctor, but she could. Jim said, she doesn't need checking on. She needs rest. She's resting. He stood up and he left, and the front door closed behind him with a sound that felt like a seal forming. Solomon looked at me. I looked at Marco. Theven was holding her younger child on her lap, and I saw her arms tighten. I said, we need to talk about this, Solomon said. Yes, so we talked about it, not well, not smoothly, with long pauses and unfinished sentences, and Caleb saying things that were too blunt, and Karen crying and Marco pacing. We talked about what we'd do if someone in our group became affected. We talked about the word affected and what it meant and what we'd actually seen, the stillness, the placement, the disorientation, the standing in water, the walking away. We talked about whether it was communicable and how, and whether proximity mattered or contact mattered, or neither. We didn't know. We had no information. We were making policy out of fear and best guesses, and the half-remembered language of a radio broadcast that told us nothing useful. What we agreed on. If someone showed signs, prolonged disorientation, the stillness, unresponsiveness, they would be isolated. Not expelled, not harmed, isolated. Given a room, given food, given water, given time. Monitored. If they recovered, they came back. If they didn't, we'd figure that out later. It felt humane when we said it. It felt like the kind of thing decent people decide. I remember feeling almost proud that we'd managed to be rational and kind simultaneously. That pride lasted about 30 hours. Because here's what happened. Delia didn't get better. She slept for most of 2 days, and then on the 3rd day, Jim came to the meeting, and he looked like he'd been crying, and he said she was awake, but she wasn't. She wasn't right. He said she was sitting in the kitchen facing the window, and she wouldn't talk, and she wouldn't eat. And when he touched her arm, she didn't react. He said her eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. He said, she's in there, but she's not in there. We went to their house. All of us except Feven, who stayed with the kids. We went, and we stood in the Pratt's kitchen doorway, and we looked at Delia. She was sitting at the table in a bathrobe. Her hands were flat on the table surface. Her head was tilted. That 15-degree tilt I'd seen before in the woman in Scrubs. Her eyes were open and her mouth was slightly open, and she was breathing. I could see the rise and fall, but nothing else was happening. No eye movement. No response when Jim said her name. No response when Solomon clapped his hands. No response when I pulled a chair up across from her and said, Delia, can you hear me? In my teacher voice, the one that cuts through noise. She was there and she wasn't. The body was occupied, but the occupant had, I don't want to say left, I don't know if left is accurate, receded, maybe, moved to a back room in herself. Jim said, what do I do? Nobody said anything, because what we'd agreed on, isolation, a room, time, assumed the person would be somewhere else, assumed we'd move them to a neutral space. But Delia was in her own house, was her kitchen. Jim was her husband. The isolation protocol we designed was for a stranger or an abstraction. It was not for Jim Pratt, 75. who'd been married to this woman for 46 years, and who was now standing in his own kitchen asking us what to do with her. Karen said softly. "She could come to my house. I have the spare room," Jim said. "She's not leaving this house," Marco said. Jim said. "She's not leaving. She's sick. She needs rest. She'll get better. People get sick, and they get better. That's how it works." Caleb said, "Mr. Pratt, she's not sick. Look at her." "That's not sick." Everyone turned to look at Caleb. He was 19. He'd said the thing no one else would say. He was right, and he shouldn't have said it. And I wanted to simultaneously thank him and tell him to shut up. Jim said, "Get out of my house. All of you, get out." We left. We stood on the Pratt's front lawn in the March sun that was too warm for the season. Texas spring hitting early, everything blooming aggressively, and Solomon said, "We can't make him. It's his wife," I said. If she changes further, if she becomes mobile like the others, she knows where we all live. She knows where the kids sleep." The silence after that was the worst silence we'd had yet. Because I'd said the thing that was under the thing. The affected people we'd seen so far were strangers. They came from the Greenbelt, from the road, from somewhere else. They drifted through like weather. But Delia knew us. If whatever she was becoming retained anything, any memory, any orientation to this place, then she wasn't a stranger drifting through. She was a threat that knew the layout. Solomon said, "We're not there yet. Let's not get ahead of it." But we were ahead of it. In our heads, we were already there. I could see it on every face. The moral architecture we'd built, decent, humane, isolate, don't expel, was meeting its first real test, and it was already buckling because the real test wasn't a stranger. It was Jim's wife. It was someone we'd eaten dinner with. 2 days later, a Thursday, I woke up at 4 a.m. to Marco shaking my shoulder. He was at the window. I got up and looked out, and in the pre-dawn gray I could see 3 figures standing in the street. Not moving, spaced evenly, maybe 30 feet apart, facing our house, facing our windows, the tilt, the stillness. 3 of them, and one of them, the one closest to our driveway, was wearing a bathrobe. I said, "Is that Delia?" Marco said, "I think so." I said, "Where's Jim?" Marco didn't answer. We watched. The 3 figures stood for approximately 40 minutes. I know, because I checked the clock when we first saw them and checked again when they moved. At 4:43 they walked, all 3 at the same time, in the same direction, south toward the Greenbelt, at the same pace in step. Not coordinated the way soldiers march, but synchronized the way a flock turns. One movement, 3 bodies. Delia was among them, and she walked like she'd always walked, slightly favoring her left knee, the gait I recognized from 2 months of neighborhood proximity, except that her arms hung differently, looser, like they weren't being held, just carried. When the sun came up, Marco went to check on Jim. I watched from the porch. He knocked. He waited. He knocked again. He tried the door, and it was unlocked, and he went in, and he was inside for about 3 minutes, and when he came back out, his face was a color I'd never seen on him. Not pale, not green. Something else. Something gray at the edges. He walked to me and he said, "Jim's in the bedroom. He's in the bed. He He stopped. He took a breath. He's in the bed and he's not breathing. And he's been dead for a while. Maybe a day. Maybe more, I said. How? He said. I don't know. I didn't look closely. I couldn't tell. There's no blood. He's just in the bed. Like he went to sleep. I said, did she kill him? Marco said, I don't know. I don't know if that's what it is. I don't know if she chose to or if. I don't know anything. His voice broke on the last word. Not a big break, a hairline fracture. I heard it, and I put my hand on his arm, and he put his hand over mine, and we stood there on the porch in the morning heat, and the subdivision was silent around us. We told the group. Caleb said, we should have forced Jim to let us take her. Karen said we couldn't have forced him. Solomon said the relevant question wasn't what we should have done, but what we should do now. Phevan said the kids were not sleeping well, and that her daughter had asked if the standing people were ghosts. I said, they're coming to this street specifically. They're not just passing through anymore. 3 of them stood here last night, facing our houses. They knew where to stand. Solomon said, we don't know they knew. I said, they were facing our windows. Solomon said, coincidence is. I said, Solomon. They were evenly spaced and facing our windows, and one of them was Delia. This is not random. He sat with that. Then he said, okay, what does that mean for us? It meant we had to decide again. Stay or go. Except now, staying had a new texture. It wasn't just waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. It was staying in a place that was being observed, being watched, being stood at in the night by things that might have been our neighbors. And going meant what? We didn't know what was south. We didn't know what was north. The radio was still looping its useless script. The military had left without explanation. We were 8 adults and 2 children with 3 working vehicles and enough food for maybe another week and a half, and no information about what was beyond the next intersection in any direction. Marco and I made the decision that night, in bed, in the dark, whispering like the house might hear us. We would go. We would take whoever wanted to come. We would drive south toward Austin and see what there was to see. And if Austin was gone, we'd keep driving. I said, tomorrow? He said, tomorrow? I said, what if Solomon doesn't want to go? He said, then we go without him. But I think he'll go. He has kids, I said. What if it's worse out there? He said, it's getting worse here. Here the worse is coming to us. At least out there we're moving toward it on our terms, I said. That's not better, he said. No, but it's a choice. In the dark, his hand found my hand and held it. And we lay there, and I listened to the house. And the house was quiet, and the street beyond the house was quiet, and somewhere in that quiet things were standing and looking at our walls and knowing where we were. Morning meeting, Marco made the pitch. Everyone was quiet. Then Caleb said, I'm in. Then Karen said, I can't drive at night. My eyes. Then Solomon said, how far? Then Phevan said something to Solomon in Amharic, and he nodded and said, we're in. When do we go? We went that afternoon. Not tomorrow. That afternoon. Because Solomon said something that accelerated everything. He said he'd been watching from the upstairs window the previous night, and the 3 standing figures hadn't been the only ones. He said there were more in the greenbelt. He said he'd counted 7, visible only because of the lighter clothing some of them wore, standing among the trees, facing the houses, a loose perimeter forming in the dark. 7, plus the 3 in the street. 10. There'd been 1 2 weeks ago, the woman in scrubs, then 1 at the retention pond, then 3, now 10. The math was simple. The math was a curve. We took 2 trucks and Karen's sedan. Food, water, gas cans, blankets, the radio. The kids rode with Phelan and Solomon in their SUV. Caleb rode with Karen to help her drive. Marco and I led in our truck. We drove south on 1431, past the abandoned checkpoint, past the orange tape, onto 183 toward Austin. The highway was not empty. It was the opposite of empty, but in the wrong way. It was full of stopped cars, not crashed, stopped, parked, doors open. Some running, engines idling with that dry sound that means the gas is almost gone. Others dead and cold. We weaved through them slowly, 20 miles an hour, and I looked into every car we passed, and most of them were empty. A few had belongings, bags, car seats, water bottles. One had a dog in the back seat, alive, pressing its nose against the window. Marco slowed, and I said, "Don't stop," and he didn't stop. We didn't talk about the dog. 6 miles south we saw smoke. Not wildfire smoke. Structural smoke. Dark, oily, rising from multiple points in what I thought was the Cedar Park area. We kept driving. The road opened up a bit. Fewer stopped cars, and then closed again near the Lackline Mall exit where there was an actual blockage. A semi-truck jackknifed across 3 lanes. We went onto the shoulder, onto the grass around it. The mall parking lot to our right was, I want to describe this accurately. There were people in the parking lot, maybe 40 or 50. They were standing, not in a group, evenly spaced, the way you'd place pieces on a board if you were covering maximum area, facing different directions. Still, Marco said, "Don't look at them," I said. "I'm looking," he said. "Andy," I said, "I need to see. I need to know what this is," he said. "We know what it is." We drove past. In the mirror, I watched them not react to us. 50 people in a parking lot, standing still at midday, and a truck drove by and they didn't look. Whatever they were doing, whatever that stillness was for, it was not about us. Or it was about us in a way that didn't require looking. The 183 took us toward the 35 interchange, and the 35 was impassable. Not from cars, from a barrier. Concrete new. Highway dividers arranged in a wall across all lanes, north and south, fresh. This was military. This had been placed by heavy equipment recently, and there was no way through it. Marco stopped the truck. Solomon pulled up beside us. We got out and stood in the road and looked at the wall. It was maybe 12 feet high. "No gaps," Caleb said. "They blocked the highway." Solomon said, "They blocked us out, or they blocked something in." I climbed onto the hood of the truck and then the cab roof, and from there I could just see over the wall, and what I saw on the other side was nothing. Empty road. Clean. No stopped cars, no bodies, no smoke. The highway on the other side of the wall was clear, swept, maintained. Someone was maintaining it. Someone on that side had resources and equipment and a plan. I got down. I said, "The other side is clean. It's clear. Someone's running things over there." Marco said. So this is the line, I said. This is the line. We're on the outside. Karen said, of what? Nobody answered, because the answer was obvious and terrible. The critical zone the radio mentioned. The designated area. The priority. We were outside it. The checkpoint hadn't been protecting us. It had been monitoring us, checking us, watching to see if we were still us. And when the math tipped, when whatever threshold they'd set was exceeded, they pulled the checkpoint and sealed the highway and left us here, on this side, with them. The drive back was silent. We took a different route, surface streets, winding through residential that looked like ours. Tracked homes, empty, doors open, cars stopped. Occasionally, a figure standing in a yard or on a sidewalk. Always still, always that tilt. We drove past them, and they didn't react, and we didn't stop. We got back to the neighborhood at dusk. The green belt was visible from the end of the street, and in the failing light, I counted it. 11 figures in the tree line, spaced like sentries, facing the houses. More than yesterday, the math continued. That night, we all slept in the Johannes house. All 8 adults, both kids. Nobody wanted to be in their own home. Nobody wanted to be separated by walls and yards. And the dark, we pushed furniture. We made floor beds. The kids shared the couch. Solomon took first watch. I couldn't sleep, but I lay still because lying still was all I could offer anyone. At 2 a.m., Solomon woke Marco, who woke me. Solomon's face, in the light of the single battery lantern we kept going, was doing something I hadn't seen before. His features were arranged correctly, but the control was costing him something. He said, "They're in the street." We went to the window. I counted. I kept counting. I counted 23. They were in the street and on the lawns and between the houses, standing distributed. The spacing was consistent, not perfect, but consistent, as if governed by a rule about proximity. They faced different directions, some toward houses, some toward other figures, some toward nothing. One was on the Hendersons' porch, standing at the door. One was in our driveway next to our truck, facing the truck's window. Stephen was behind us, she said. Are they trying to get in? I said. No, they're not trying anything. They're just standing, she said. For how long? Nobody, we answered. We watched. For 3 hours we watched. The children slept. The adults stood at windows and watched 23 bodies arranged in the dark on our street, and none of them moved. None of them tried doors or windows. None of them made sound. They stood in the warm March night, and they were patient in a way that felt vast and certain and completely unconcerned with us. At 5:15, as the sky turned gray, they walked, all at the same time, not toward us, away, back to the green belt, back to wherever they gathered during the day, back to the trees or the retention ponds or the open fields. In 5 minutes, the street was empty. In 10 minutes, you couldn't tell they'd been there at all, except for the feeling which stayed, which didn't leave with them. Caleb said, "We have to go today, not south, another direction. We can't stay here," Solomon said, "and go where we've seen the highway." Caleb said, "West, north, anywhere but here." Karen said, "What if it's everywhere?" The question hung. What if it's everywhere? What if there is no outside, no clean zone, No other side of the wall. What if the wall isn't keeping something in or out, but simply dividing the dead from the living for organizational purposes? Marco said. There was one thing different about the south side of that wall. It was maintained. It was clean. Someone is alive over there, and they have enough control to keep a highway clear. That means there's infrastructure. That means there's a response. It's just not here, I said. So how do we get to the other side? He said. We go around. Or we go through. We couldn't go through. We'd seen the wall, so we went around. That afternoon, our second exodus in 2 days, we drove west on 1431, past Round Rock, into the hill country. The plan, if you could call it a plan, was to arc wide, get below the wall's western terminus. It had to end somewhere and approach Austin from the south or southwest. The hill country was different, less dense, fewer houses. The roads were emptier and the stopped cars were farther apart. And for the first 20 miles, I felt something in my chest loosen. Space, open sky, no tree lines with figures standing in them, just limestone and cedar and the road. Then we found the second wall, smaller, not highway dividers, but a trench. An actual trench dug across Route 71, with the excavated earth piled on the far side. Military, recent, impassable by vehicle. We backtracked, tried another road, found it blocked by fallen trees. Not wind-fallen, but cut. Chainsaw cuts, fresh, laid deliberately across both lanes. Solomon said, at the third blocked road, they're not just keeping us from Austin. They're keeping us contained. This is the perimeter. We're inside it. I stood in the road next to our truck and I looked at the cut trees and the yellow Texas dust and the blue sky that didn't care. And I understood with a clarity that felt physical, like a temperature change, that the checkpoint had never been protection. It had been assessment. The soldiers had been watching us the way you watch a petri dish. And when the culture reached a certain density, when the ratio of affected to unaffected crossed whatever line they'd drawn, they sealed the dish. We were the dish. We were inside with the culture, and the culture was growing, and nobody was coming to open the lid, because the lid was the point. We drove back to the street, to the houses, to the place where the math kept advancing, and the nights kept bringing more standing figures, and the days kept passing without rescue or explanation, or even the radio, which had gone dead by then. Just static, all frequencies, as if even the broadcast had decided we weren't worth the electricity. That night, our first night back after the failed escape, 31. I counted 31 in the dark, on the street, on the lawns, between houses, closer than before. One was on the porch of the house directly across from the Johannes. One was at our front door, standing palm flat on the wood. The same gesture I'd seen at the Mueller's back door a week earlier. Palm placed. Fingers spread, waiting for what? The next day Marco said we should try on foot, leave the vehicles, go through the Greenbelt, through the open land, cross country. I said, that's where they come from. The Greenbelt, the trees. That's where they are during the day, he said. We don't know that for certain, I said. Solomon counted them going back there at dawn, he said. Maybe they're deeper. Maybe we can go around them, I said. With the kids? On foot? Well, through whatever is in those trees? He didn't answer. Feven answered. She said, I'm not taking my children into the trees. If we go on a road, Solomon said. The roads are blocked, Feven said. Then we stay until they're not. Caleb said, they're never going to unblock. They left us. Do you understand? They left us here to... He stopped. He was going to say it, to die. He was going to say they left us here to die or to become. And I watched him stop, and I watched him look at the kids, and I watched him not say it, and I thought, he is learning. He is learning what adults know, which is that the truth is not always the thing you say out loud. We stayed. We stayed because there was no choice that didn't have a cost we couldn't pay. We organized our days more tightly. Water was rationed. Watches were expanded. 4-hour shifts, 2 people per shift. We moved all sleeping to the upper floor of the Johannes house. Ground floor was sealed, not fortified, because they never tried to enter, but sealed. Curtains closed, doors locked, not because locks would stop anything, but because the act of locking was the act of choosing a boundary. It was a thing you did. It was a decision. Since Karen stopped eating. Not abruptly, over days. She said she wasn't hungry. She said her stomach was off. She said the stress, but I watched her, and I watched her getting thinner and her eyes getting larger in her face. And I thought, is this grief? Is this fear? Or is this the beginning? I asked her. On the 4th day of her not eating, I pulled her aside and I said, Karen, do you feel different? She looked at me with an expression I'll carry for the rest of my life. Offended and terrified simultaneously. Offended that I'd asked. Terrified that I'd seen something she hadn't seen in herself. She said, I'm scared, that's all. I'm scared, and I can't eat when I'm scared. I said, okay, she said, don't look at me like that. I'm still me, Andrea. I'm still me. I said, I know, but I didn't know, and she didn't know. And that was the thing that was worse than the figures in the dark, the not knowing about each other. About ourselves. The private question you ask in your own head when you wake up. Am I still me? How would I know? If the change is internal before it's external, if there's a period where you're becoming and you don't realize, then every morning is a test. You can't grade yourself. Marco and I talked about this once, in the dark, in whispers. I said, if it happens to me, if I start to change, would you tell me? He said, yes. I said, would I believe you? He said, I don't know. I said, if it happens to you, he said, you'd tell me. I said, and would you believe me? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I don't know. I think if it's happening to you, you don't think it's happening. That's the thing. Jim didn't think it was happening to Delia until she was gone. If you're inside it, it probably feels like normal, like just being tired, like just being still. I said, that's the worst thing you've ever said to me. He said, I know. On the 9th day after the checkpoint disappeared, I kept counting the days from the checkpoint because it was the last clear marker, the last timestamp from the outside world. On the 9th day, Marco and Caleb did something I'd agreed to in principle, but couldn't watch. They went to the greenbelt, not deep, just to the edge. In daylight at noon, when the standing figures seemed to be fewer or less visible, they went with binoculars and the hunting knife Caleb had, and the tire iron from the truck. They were gone for 40 minutes, and I stood on the porch of the Johannes house. And I watched the tree line, and my heart was a fist in my chest, clenched and aching. They came back. They were walking fast, but not running. Marco's face was the gray color again. Caleb was a shade I'd describe as translucent. The blood gone from his skin in a way that made his freckles look painted on. Inside, door closed, Marco said. There's a lot of them in there. More than we thought. It's like a gathering point. They stand in the trees during the day and come out at night. Some are sitting, some are lying down. But it's hard to explain, Caleb said. They're organized like they're not random. They're in a pattern. Rings. Like concentric circles around. I couldn't see what was in the center. But they're arranged, Solomon said. Around what? Caleb said, I don't know. It's deeper in. I wasn't going deeper in. Marco said, the ones at the edge, the outer ring. Some of them looked at us. The room went still. I said, looked at you. He said, turned their heads. When we were about 20 yards in, 3 of them turned their heads, and it wasn't aggressive. It was like acknowledgement, like we were noticed. And then they turned back. I said, did they move towards you? He said, no. They just noticed and went back to whatever they were doing. Standing, being still. Caleb said, I don't think they care about us. This landed differently than he intended. Because if they didn't care about us, if the standing in our street, the palm on the door, the nightly perimeter, wasn't aggression or predation or hunting, then what was it? What were they doing? If they weren't trying to get us, then why were they here? Solomon said, the thing I'd been thinking. What if they're not surrounding us? What if they're just spreading? And we happen to be in the area they're spreading into, like water, like the way water fills a basin, not because it wants what's in the basin, because it fills available space. We weren't prey. We were terrain. That was worse. I want to be clear about that. That was worse than being hunted, because being hunted means you matter. Being terrain means you don't. Being terrain means they will fill the space you occupy, and whether you are there or not is irrelevant to the filling. Day 12. The nightly count was 50 plus. I stopped counting at 50 because counting was taking too long and the light was too dim to be certain. They filled the street. They were on every porch. They stood against every wall. Some of them were people I recognized. Not Delia anymore. I hadn't seen Delia since that first night she walked away, but others. The Mueller husband, a woman I'd seen at HEB, a teenager who might have been a student at the high school, faces I'd categorized as neighbor, now categorized as something else, and they were still not trying to get in, not a single attempt at a door or window in 12 days, just standing, just being present, just occupying the space with a patience that felt geological. Day 14. Karen didn't wake up. I found her during morning routine. I was bringing water to her room, and she was in bed, and her eyes were open, and she was breathing, but she wasn't there. The tilt was there. Even lying down, her head was tilted on the pillow. Her eyes were open and looking at the ceiling, but not looking at anything. I said her name. Nothing. I touched her arm. Warm, not hot, not fever warm, just alive warm. I shook her gently, nothing. Her eyes didn't move. Her hands were at her sides, palms up, fingers slightly spread. I went downstairs. I said, "Karen." Everyone knew from my voice. Feven put her face in her hands. Caleb kicked the wall. Solomon closed his eyes and opened them and said, "How long do we think?" I said, "I don't know." She wasn't eating. She was afraid. Is fear enough? Can being afraid enough for long enough make use? Nobody knew. Nobody could know. Was the change external, a pathogen, a signal, a proximity effect? Or was it internal, a threshold of despair, a giving up, a decision made below the level of consciousness to stop fighting for the self? Was Karen affected because something got her, or because she let go? We carried her downstairs. We laid her on the couch. We watched her for 3 hours, and she didn't move except to breathe. Then, at approximately 2 p.m., she sat up, in a single motion like a lever pulled. She sat up, and she stood, and she walked to the front door, and she stood in front of it, with her palm flat against the wood from the ends, the same gesture. Palm flat, fingers spread. But from our side, Marco said, "She wants to go out." I said, "Do we let her?" Silence, a horrible, stretching silence. And then Solomon who was rational, Solomon who was systematic, Solomon who had kept us alive with his whiteboards and his calm. Solomon walked to the door and unlocked it and opened it. Karen walked out. She walked down the porch steps. She walked across the lawn. She walked into the street where 3 of them were standing. It was afternoon. Most had retreated to the green belt, but some stayed, always a few. And she walked past them, and they didn't react. And she walked toward the tree line, and she was gone. Caleb said, "Why did you do that?" Solomon said, "Because she was already gone, and because I will not lock the dead inside my house with my children." Caleb said, "She wasn't dead." Solomon said, "She wasn't alive either," and then quieter, "I don't know what she was. I don't know what any of them are, but whatever it isn't us. And holding it inside the walls doesn't make us safer. It makes us captors." I think about that. I still think about that. Whether he was right, whether mercy looks like opening the door, or whether it looks like keeping them inside where they're warm and fed, and maybe, recoverable, I don't know. Nobody told us. Nobody explained the mechanisms or the timeline, or whether it's reversible. Nobody told us anything. The checkpoint disappeared, and the radio died, and the walls went up, and we were left to make every decision in total darkness. Day 15. I'm going to tell this part quickly because if I don't, I'll stop. Day 15, early morning, I woke up, and Marco wasn't beside me. I reached for him, and the sheets were cold. He'd been gone for a while. I got up. I went downstairs. He was in the living room, standing at the window, looking out at the street. It was dark. 3 a.m. maybe. The figures were out there, the nightly congregation. He was watching them. I said, "Marco." He didn't turn around. I said, "Marco, come back to bed." He turned. He looked at me. His eyes were his eyes. His face was his face. He was present. He was there. He said, "I was just watching." I said, "How long have you been watching?" He said, "I don't know, a while." He paused. "They're beautiful." Something in my chest collapsed. not broke, collapsed, like a structure losing a key support. The load redistributed instantly into my legs and my hands and my throat, but the thing that had been holding it was gone. I said, "Beautiful?" he said. "Not, I don't mean. I mean the pattern, the way they're arranged. If you watch long enough, you can see it. The spacing isn't random. It changes, slowly, over the night, like breathing. Like a single organism breathing, and the bodies are the breath." I said, "Marco, come upstairs now." He looked at me, and I watched him. I watched him come back. I watched whatever was pulling him toward the window release its hold, and I watched my husband return to his face from somewhere he'd been drifting toward. He blinked. He shook his head slightly. He said, yeah, okay." He came upstairs. He came to bed. He held me, and I held him, and I was awake for the rest of the night, listening to his breathing, counting it, making sure it stayed regular, making sure it stayed his. In the morning, I told Solomon, just Solomon. Outside, out of earshot of Marco, I said. He was watching them. He said they were beautiful. Solomon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." I said, "You know what?" He said, "I know there. I've felt it too, the pull, the watching. It's easier to watch them than to not watch them. There's something about the pattern that makes you want to keep looking." He paused. "I've been making myself not look. I close my eyes on watch. I just listen. I don't look," I said. Is that how it starts? Looking?" He said, "I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But I think looking makes it easier. For whatever it is." From that point on, the watch protocol changed. We listened. We didn't look. At night, we kept curtains closed. We stayed on the upper floor. We did not look at the street. This was the new rule. Do not look. But we still heard them. Heard the silence they made, which was its own kind of sound. The absence of insects, the absence of wind, the specific quality of air that is being stood in by 50 or 60 bodies that aren't doing anything a body is supposed to do. You can hear the wrongness even without seeing it. You can feel the distribution through the walls. Day 17, Caleb left. Not the way Karen left. Caleb left on purpose in daylight with a backpack and a knife. He said he was walking north. He said he'd rather die walking than die staying. He said, and this is a direct quote because I wrote it in the log, "I'm not going to sit here until I start standing." Marco tried to stop him. Solomon tried to stop him. I did not try to stop him because I understood him and because his choice was not wrong. His choice was a choice. In a situation with no choices, any choice is an act of selfhood. He was choosing to be a person who goes rather than a person who wastes. I could not argue with that. He walked up the street in the noon sun. His backpack was red. I watched from the upstairs window, not looking at them, just at him until he reached the end of the street and turned north and was gone. I never saw him again, and I don't know what happened to him. And the not knowing is its own kind of living weight that I carry in the place where certainty should be. Day 19. I need to tell you what Marco did. I need to tell you because it's the reason I'm here and he's not. And the reason those are connected is the thing I will never be finished with. Day 19. 4 a.m. I woke because the bed was empty again. I went downstairs, and he was at the window again, and this time, when I said his name, he didn't turn. I walked to him. I put my hand on his shoulder. I turned him physically toward me, and his eyes they were his. They were still his. But they were looking through me, at the window, at what was beyond the window, at the arrangement in the dark. I said, "Marco, look at me, not the window me." He focused, slowly, like adjusting a lens. He said, "I'm okay, I'm fine. I can almost understand it. The pattern. If I watch long enough, I think I said, "You'll what?" He said, "I'll know why they left. The soldiers, why they pulled the checkpoint. I think it's in the pattern." "The answer," I said. "There is no answer in the pattern." "There is no answer. Come upstairs," he said. 5 more minutes, I said. "No." He looked at me, really looked, and his face did something I recognized. It was the face of a student who has been caught and knows it, and is embarrassed and relieved simultaneously. He said, "It's getting harder to not look." I said, "I know." He said, I think it might be easier on the other side." I said, "There is no other side. There's this side. There's us. There's me," he said. "I know." He paused. "I know. Come on. Let's go up." We went up. I didn't sleep. I listened to him breathe. I counted his breaths. 347 before the sun came up. He was asleep snipe. I was not. That afternoon, the afternoon of day 19, Marco told me to leave. He said it clearly. He said it without drama. He said, "Take the truck. Take Solomon's family. Drive east. Don't go south or west because of the walls. Go east. Maybe east is open. Maybe they didn't close everything." I said, "And you?" He said, "I'll come. I'll follow. I need one more day. I need to make sure it's not. I need to know I'm not bringing it with me." I said, "You're coming with us," he said. "Andy," he took my hands. He held them. His hands were warm and dry and solid and real. I watched them again this morning. I got up at dawn and watched them walk back to the trees, and I wanted to follow them. Not much. It wasn't an urge. It was a curiosity. Like a door you haven't opened, and I need to know if that's still just curiosity or if it's already something else. I need one day to know. And if it's just curiosity, I'll drive east and find you. And if it's something else, I said, if it's something else, you'll walk into the trees, he said. If it's something else, I won't be able to not walk into the trees. And I don't want to do that with you beside me. This is where I tell you I left him. This is where I tell you I made a choice. It wasn't heroic, and it wasn't cowardly, and it wasn't wise. It was the only thing he asked me for, and I gave it to him because I loved him, and because loving someone means honoring the shape of their fear even when it breaks you. Solomon and Phelan and the kids and I, 2 vehicles, east on 1431. Through Round Rock, through Taylor, through the nothing land of eastern Williamson County. The roads were mostly clear going east. Fewer blockages, fewer stopped cars, fewer standing figures, as if the density was centered on something west of us, and we were driving out of its radius. We drove for 4 hours. The landscape opened up, flat, agricultural, enormous sky, no walls, no trenches, no barriers, just road and land and the gradual reappearance of normalcy's markers. A gas station with its lights on, a farmhouse with laundry on a line, a tractor moving in a distant field. We stopped in a town called Rockdale. Population 4,000 maybe. There were people there, real people, awake people, people in a grocery store buying things, people who looked at us with curiosity and concern when we pulled up looking like we looked. A woman at the gas station asked if we were from Austin. I said, "Near Austin," she said. "How bad is it?" I said. "Bad." She shook her head and says, "We've been hearing things. The radio said quarantine." I said, "Yes," she said. "You got out?" I said. "We drove east," she said. "You're lucky. The south and west is sealed. They sealed it 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. The day after the checkpoint vanished. They sealed it and they left us inside. And we'd spent 2 weeks not knowing we were supposed to be in there. And now we were out. And we were out because they hadn't sealed the east. Or they had, and we'd found a gap. Or they hadn't sealed the east because the east was where they expected it to spread next. And we'd driven into the next container, not out of the last one. I didn't say that. I took the gas and I took the water, and we drove to the community center where a man who might have been the mayor was organizing, arriving people, and we were given cots in a gymnasium, and Solomon's kids fell asleep in 11 sound, and Solomon stood with his back to the wall, and his eyes closed, and I sat on a cot, and I felt the absence of Marco's weight beside me, like an amputation, not a phantom limb, a real absence, a place where something was supposed to be and wasn't. I waited 3 days. I waited for a truck to pull into Rockdale with Marco driving it. I waited the way you wait for someone when you've agreed to wait, actively, with your face toward the direction they'll come from. I sat on the community center steps in the morning and evening and watched the road west. He didn't come. On the 4th day, I tried to drive back. Solomon stopped me, not physically, with words. He said, "If you go back, you won't come out again. They're closing the Eastern Corridor. National Guard showed up yesterday. They're setting positions on the 79. If you go back in, you will not come back out," I said. "He's my husband." He said, "Yes, and you're alive." And he asked you to be alive. That's what he asked for. I stayed. I stayed because Solomon was right, and because Marco had asked me to go, and because I could feel. Even from Rockdale, even from 50 miles east, I could feel the pull. At night, in the quiet, the wanting to look, the curiosity about the pattern, the sense that something was arranging itself just beyond the edge of what I could see, and that if I just looked long enough, I'd understand it, and understanding would be relief, would be peace, would be the end of this horrible not knowing. I don't look. I want you to understand that. I'm here, and I'm telling you this, and I don't look. At night, I close my eyes, and I keep them closed. I turn away from windows. I don't watch the dark. I don't try to see the pattern. But I know it's there. From here, from wherever they relocated us, this facility, this building, with its fluorescent lights and its cots and its measured meals. I know it's there, growing, spreading, the perimeter moving east, the nightly count increasing in every direction, the military pulling back and pulling back and pulling back and never explaining why, because the why is simple. They cannot stop it. It is not aggressive. It does not attack. It simply stands and waits and fills available space. And the people in the space eventually stop being people and start being part of the pattern. And no one can point to the moment it happens because the moment isn't a moment. It's a slope. It's a drift. It's watching too long. It's being too afraid for too many days. It's the exhaustion of maintaining the self against something that offers the relief of not having to maintain anymore. That's why the military left the checkpoint. Not because they were overrun, not because they were ordered to fall back, not because of casualties or supplies or strategy. They left because some of them were starting to watch. I know because I watched Marco start. I know because I felt myself start. It begins as observation and becomes fascination and becomes comprehension and becomes allegiance, so gradually that every step feels like your own choice. The soldiers stood at that checkpoint and they checked faces for the tilt and the stillness, and they watched the affected walk past, and they watched the pattern form in the dark, and some of them began to see it. The beauty of it, the sense of it, the relief of it, and the ones who were still themselves looked at the ones who were starting, and they couldn't tell the difference yet, but they could feel it, the way I felt it with Marco. And they made the only decision that works. They left, fast, before watching became seeing and seeing became knowing, and knowing became joining. That's the answer. There is no answer. The checkpoint wasn't abandoned, it was fled by people who understood what proximity costs and who valued their selfhood more than their posts. I don't blame them. I understand them. I married a man who told me to flee for the same reason, and I fled, and I'm here, and I'm still me, and every night I close my eyes, and I think about the pattern, and I don't look, and the not looking is a choice I make every single night, and I don't know how many nights I have left in me. Solomon checks on me every morning. He sits across from me and he says, "How are you?" And I say, "I'm here." And he says, "Good." And we don't talk about the West, and we don't talk about Marco, and we don't talk about the fact that the perimeter is 40 miles closer than it was last week. Feven teaches her kids their math at the folding table. The 8-year-old is doing long division. The 11-year-old is reading a book she's read 4 times. They are alive and present and uninterested in the darkness, and I watch them and I think, this is what it costs. Being here, watching children do math, drinking coffee, not looking. This is the cost and the reward simultaneously. The ordinary is what you're saving when you refuse the pattern. The ordinary is the thing worth the effort of not looking. But I'll tell you what no one tells you, what the broadcasts don't say, what the debriefers don't ask. The ordinary doesn't pull. The ordinary doesn't offer relief. The ordinary requires you to keep being yourself every hour by choice with effort. And the pattern doesn't require anything. The pattern just asks you to stop trying, to watch, to let the self soften at the edges, to join the breath. I don't look, I'm here. I'm telling you this so that it's written down somewhere, and so that if I stop being here, someone will know why, and will know it wasn't because I was weak. It was because the alternative to weakness is a kind of sustained effort that humans aren't built for, not indefinitely, not alone, not without knowing when it ends. Nobody explained why the military abandoned the checkpoint. Now I have, and tomorrow night I'll close my eyes again, and the night after that, and I'll keep choosing until I can't, until choosing costs more than I have. Until the morning Solomon sits across from me and says, "How are you?" and I don't say anything. That morning is coming. I can feel it the way you feel weather. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon.